Hi, Vue.js version 3 was released, and in this video I will walk you through all the important changes that brings to us. I will show you how to migrate your Vue 2 code to Vue 3, and I will talk about the biggest new feature Vue version 3 introduces, even though that feature will be 100% optional. Now I want to start with one important note. Vue version 3 is the latest version of Vue, but there is a but. If you visit the official GitHub repository of Vue version 3, which at the moment is the Vue Next repository, not Vue, the Vue Next repository, you'll find the release notes there. You'll also find them linked below the video. And the interesting thing here is that they follow a phased release process. Now what that means is that Vue core, the core framework, is finished, it's stable, it's out there, but some other parts of the framework, for example the router and Vuex integration in the dev tools, so some other packages and things that belong to the framework and to the Vue ecosystem, are not final yet. That's why the Vue team decided to go with this phased release process, where for the moment, if you, for example, visit Vuejs.org, you still end up in the Vue 2 docs there. So you still start with Vue 2 there. Also, if you install Vue via npm, so if you run npm install, you also see that at the moment you get Vue version 2 on that latest tag. You need to run npm install Vue at next to get that real latest version. And you need to visit v3.vuejs.org to get to the Vue 3 version of the official website and documentation. Nonetheless, Vue version 3 is final and the version you should learn right now, the version you should dive into right now. You just should be aware of this phased release process and that all parts, like the web page and the npm install latest version, will only be switched to Vue 3 at the end of the year. That's the plan, at least, as you can see here. So that's something to be aware of. Nonetheless, now is the time to learn Vue 3, and if you're just starting with Vue, I would recommend that you do that with Vue version 3 because it is stable and it is the future of Vue, and the parts which still get some work might not matter to you. You can find the next steps on which the Vue team focuses here, and none of these parts should have a strong impact on you if you're just getting started with Vue at the moment. So with that, let's now explore what changed with Vue 3 and what's new. So in this video, I'll dive into the important new features and changes Vue 3 introduced. The good news is that generally what you learned about Vue 2 still applies to Vue 3. There aren't any major breaking changes that would force you to relearn everything. That is not the case. But there are a couple of changes and a couple of new features you should be aware of. So that's what we're going to have a look at in this video. I also want to highlight that I will completely update my existing Vue 2 course. So if you got that, or if you're getting it now, you get the entire Vue 3 update for free. And I will re-record the entire course based on Vue 3, even though we don't have that many changes, but this also allows me to improve the overall quality. And therefore you will get this as part of my existing Vue 2 course. It might already be updated when you're viewing this. Below the video I'll post and update the description once the course update is out. So let's start with the changes. And you will find timestamps below the video in the video description if you want to jump ahead to specific changes you're interested in. Here I will just highlight the most important changes, which will likely affect everyone, or at least a lot of people. For an exhaustive list of all changes, no matter how big or small they are, and all new features, definitely check out the official migration guide, which you also find linked below the video. Now the changes I'm going to list here will also all be shown in detail throughout this video. One change that will affect everyone is that you now create your Vue instances, your Vue apps, differently than before. The syntax changed and therefore you will need to change this in your apps as well, but changing it is simple, as you will see. In addition, the data option now must always be a method. It's no longer allowed to be just an object. And another change that will affect everyone is related to how you register components, directives, and third-party modules. This will now also work a bit differently, as you will see, but updating this and changing this will also be simple. If you're using transitions in your app, the transition component, CSS class name changed. The -enter class is now -enter from, and I'll show this in an example as well. And that's almost it when it comes to just Vue. As I mentioned, check the official migration guide for all minor changes as well, but these are the most important changes you should definitely know. Now, if you're using the Vue router, there we now also create the router differently and transitions with the router. So if you have animations for switching pages, that also works differently now. For Vuex, it generally works as you learned it, but we now create our store differently. So these are the changes, and I'll cover them with concrete examples throughout the video. We also got a couple of new features, which I'll cover. We got two minor but nice to have changes, a teleport component and support for fragments, and I'll explain both, what it is and why and how we use it in this video, of course. The biggest new feature which was added with Vue 3 is the new composition API, which, and this is important, is 100% optional. You can use it to replace the options API, so you can use it to build your components differently. Instead of using data, watch, methods, and compute it, you can use something else, but it is optional. It'll not replace the options API. You can use it, but you don't have to. And I'll also dive into that in detail, of course. And then, kind of a new feature, we got better TypeScript support. You could always use TypeScript with Vue, but since Vue 3 was internally rewritten from scratch and uses TypeScript internally, it now has better support. Now, using TypeScript is still optional, and at the moment, at least, I'm not using it for most Vue projects, but if you want to use it, you got better support. So that's the overview. With that, let's dive into the concrete examples. I prepared a little project. You find a link to the GitHub repository with all those examples attached to the video in the video description. And here we can walk through all those important changes. And let's start with a basic app, with basic app v2. Here, I'm creating a basic Vue app with Vue version 2. Creating my Vue instance, having some data, having a method to change that data, and having a component with a template, which basically has a button where I emit a custom event. That's what I'm doing here. And if we view this application by simply opening this HTML file in the browser, this is what we see, and when we click the button, this works. Now this is Vue 2, and this is what you probably know. With Vue 3, a couple of things change here. To be precise, I'll now cover these first three changes which I outlined here, because all these changes affect what we see here. So let's go to basic app v3. There, we first of all have to make sure we import the latest version of Vue. And for that, I currently have to add at next year, since at the time I'm recording this, Vue 3 is in release candidate phase and not really finally released yet. In the future, of course, this default CDN link will automatically pull in Vue 3. And I will update this repository such that all the CDN links are correct all the time. So here I'm now importing Vue 3 by adding this. And with that added here, we'll see that if I now open this index.html file in the browser, this fails. Now we clearly don't see the message anymore, because this base syntax here changed a little bit with Vue 3. Here in app.js in the v3 folder, I got the Vue 2 syntax, but this will not work anymore. Instead, to create a Vue app, we now no longer instantiate the Vue constructor function here. Instead, on Vue, we call createApp. That's a new method that was added with Vue 3. Now to this createApp method, we now need to pass our app config object, and here we can pretty much copy the object we used in Vue 2 as well. But there are two other changes you should be aware of. The L property doesn't work anymore. Instead, we now mount our app to the DOM by calling mount on the createApp object, so on the result of createApp. And to mount, we pass that CSS selector, which we previously had in L. And we can get rid of new view now. That's the first change. In addition, though, I mentioned that the data option also changed and now always needs to be a method. Now in Vue 2, both was allowed. You could have just an object and you could have a method, though a method was recommended in Vue 2 as well, especially if you worked with multiple components and so on, then you needed a method. Well, now with Vue 3, data always needs to be a method, so we simply should turn data into a method, which then returns our data object. So that's the only change we need to make here. Besides that, it works as before. And for example, methods, computed and watch, those things all work as you learn it. Nothing needs to change there. And with that, we already covered the first two changes here. Now the third change, which we should be aware of, also affects this demo app I prepared. Components, directives, third-party modules, all those things are now registered on the app instead of the global Vue object. So calling Vue.component, that's not how this works anymore. Instead, createApp creates an app, and we can store this in a constant. And then on this app, we can call mount, for example. Now, it's also on this app that we have to call component, directive, and use to use third-party modules. We'll see use in action later with the router and Vuex. So here, we can call component, and then pass this component code, which we also passed to the component method before, so these two arguments, to this component method here. So it works as before, but now it's on the app instead of the global Vue object. So with that, we get rid of this line here as well. With that, however, if I save all of that, and I reload, we got our message back, we got the button, and it works. Now, one minor change, which I didn't highlight on the slide, if you have a component that emits a custom method, like here, this component, it emits update, there also is a new option you can pass to this Vue instance config object here, and that's the emits option. It's basically the counterpart to props, you could say. With props, you specify all the props a component receives, and that was already the case with Vue 2. With emits, you now can and should also specify the custom events a component emits. It's technically not required, but it makes your component easier to understand. Now I can immediately see which custom event will be emitted somewhere in this component. It's a minor change, but also something to be aware of. And with that, we covered these first three changes you should know. Now the fourth change is related to transitions. There, a CSS class name changed. I also prepared an example for that. The transitions folders here. Let's start with transitions v2. If we open that in the browser, we got this button, and with that we can toggle the box here, which has a transition attached to it. This transition works simply because I'm wrapping the box with the built-in transition component and then adding my transition CSS classes down there in the CSS file. And this all worked with Vue 2, of course, because that's a Vue 2 example here. Now with Vue 3, this changes. If I make sure that I import Vue 3 here in the v3 folder, this example, if I load the v3 example, breaks. Now it breaks because we need to create the app differently. So let's quickly do that. Vue create app, instead of L, call mount here, and then also make sure data is a method. That's what we just learned. I just wanted to practice it here again. But that's a simple change, of course. With that, we create the app properly, and hence if we reload, now this works. But you'll notice that the remove animation works, but the enter animation does not work, because a CSS class name changed. The -enter class is now -enter-from, basically to be in line with the other class names, because we had -enter-active and -enter-to already. Now we also have -enter-from for the starting class instead of just -enter. And it's the same for leaving. This here should be -leave-from instead of just -leave. So a simple renaming of the class names is enough here. And once we do that, save everything, now we got the animations back in Vue free as well. So that were transitions. We also got changes when we're using the Vue router. So let's see what changed there. For that, I also prepared two projects. Here's the Vue 2 version, here's the Vue free version. And here I used the Vue CLI to create projects, so it's no longer just an index.html file. Therefore, I'll navigate in router v2, run npm install, and then npm run serve, and this will install all the dependencies and then also bring up the development server for the Vue 2 version of this app here. Once you load the app, this is what you should see on the screen. We got two routes and we can switch between them, and we got a nice animation. Now, how is this built? I simply have my router set up in main.js by using Vue router, which is imported from Vue router, and by adding the router here to the global Vue instance, registering all the routes, setting mode to history, and we have the animation because the router view is wrapped with this transition. This is how it works in Vue 2. That's what you also learned in my course. If we go to the Vue free version and also install everything there and start the development server, we'll see a difference. To be precise, initially we'll not see anything because I haven't added routing there yet. In the router Vue free folder in main.js, we still have to add the router. For a good reason, because we now add it differently than before. Instead of importing Vue router from Vue router, I already installed the Vue router package here, that's why it's available. But instead of importing it like this, you import createRouter from Vue router. So you might see a theme here. We have createApp from Vue to createApp. We have createRouter from the router to createRouter. This is the new way of creating things in Vue free. Now, once this is imported, we can create our router by calling createRouter. And we then use this router on our Vue app. So we can store the app in a constant and then call use on the app instead of on the global object. I mentioned before that we no longer do that. Instead, we call app use and use the router. This is how we add the router. But now we also need to configure the router. For that, we still pass a config object to createRouter. And now we can generally grab the configuration from Vue 2. So here I will grab the object which was previously passed to Vue router and paste this here into my createRouter function call. The routes configuration works just as you learned it. That's the good news. The mode, however, is set up differently. Instead of setting mode to history, you now need to set a history property in this config object and then create a history with another function. And here you typically import create web history and then simply execute this here. And the result of that is provided as a value to history. This is how you set up a default router using the HTML5 history mode for routing. With that, we just have to add the imports to welcome screen and users list, copy that from the v2 example into main.js in the Vue free example, like this. And now if we reload, our routes work again. But you will notice that the transition is missing. We got no animation. I also have another small addition or note which I want to bring up first. In the header component, in the Vue free project, there is the exact prop on router link. This prop was needed with Vue 2 and the router for Vue 2 to make sure that the home link wasn't marked as active when we were on users, because users also starts with a slash. With Vue free and the router for Vue free, the router works differently internally and you no longer need this. It will automatically detect that home isn't active if you are on users. That's just a minor thing, but also worth knowing. More important than that, as I just mentioned, the transitions don't work anymore. The reason for that is that with Vue free and the router for Vue free, you no longer may wrap router view with transition. Instead, it needs to be the other way around. Now you need to pass transition into the router view. So the router view should wrap transition. This is related to changes made internally in the Vue router package. So router view in the end has a slot internally and needs this transition. The problem just is transition, of course, should wrap the component that is swapped. And for that, you can use another feature built into Vue. It's the dynamic component feature. You can use the built-in component. This tells Vue which component to render. Now the router determines which component should be rendered. And you can get access here in this slot in the end by using a feature called scoped slots. This feature already existed in Vue 2, and in my latest course update, the Vue free course update, which I added to my existing Vue course, I cover it in detail as well. You simply have a directive, the vslot directive, which you add to router view, and there you can then get access to special props which the router view exposes to you. You can now use these props here between the router view tags and bind the is prop on component, which component needs, to slotprops.component with a capital C. This prop here is exposed to you by the router, and it holds the component that should be loaded for the selected route. This syntax certainly looks strange, but you only need it if you plan on using transitions with the router. Otherwise, you don't need it. With that, however, if I save this, now the transitions are back. Well, at least almost. We also need to adjust the transition names. As you learned a second ago, it's now enter-from and leave-from. And once we do that, now the transitions are fully fixed, and now we got nice animations for entering and leaving. You might notice that if you load the app, you also got an initial transition here, and that's also related to how the Vue router works internally. If you want to avoid this, you need to mount your app only once the router is fully initialized, and you can do this by going to main.js and calling router is ready, which gives you a promise which resolves once the router is ready. So if you mount your app in the function you pass to this then block, then you make sure the app is only mounted once the router is fully initialized. And this will ensure that you don't get this initial transition. So with this change made to main.js, now we can load without the initial transition, and we still got the transition for route changes. So as you can tell, we have a couple of changes to the Vue router, not to its core logic, but how you set it up and how you add transitions. And now, I guess you are aware of these changes. Great. Now the last change I want to cover here is a change to Vuex. The store is now created with createStore there. I also got an example for that. You find it in the Vuex folders. And if we have a look at the Vue 2 version here, with npm install and npm run serve, you will see that it works just as you learned it. We create our Vuex store by instantiating new Vuex store and passing our store config to it. And then we add the store to the Vue app like this. With that, this is what we get. And here we got a basic store, which is managing this list of users here. Now with Vue free, this works differently. If I dive into the Vue free version of this and start this all, we first of all have to add Vuex again, just as we had to add the router before, because now we add it differently, as you might guess. Now we import createStore from Vuex, again, to be in line with how we create things in Vue free. Then we create our store by calling createStore. And now the good news is, to createStore, we pass exactly the same store config object as we did with Vue 2 and Vuex for Vue 2. So we can grab this object here, which holds the state and mutations and actions and getters, and we use that same object here for Vue free. And that's important. How you work with Vuex and which features it has that has all not changed. You still have actions, getters, mutations, state. You can use modules. That's the same. But now we create the store like this, and we then add it to our app by, you might also be guessing it already, by using it. So on our app, we simply use the store. And if we also had a router here, we would simply use the router as well. We don't have it here, but this is how you would use it. And with that, if you reload the Vue free version, this also works without any other changes. Now that's it for the changes you should be aware of. Now let's dive into the new features. Here we got a teleport component and a feature called Fragments. Now what's that all about? Again, I prepared something for you, the teleport fragments folder. Let's dive into that. And npm install and npm run serve. Once this is up and running, if I reload, that is what I got. And if I click on a button here, I get this modal where I can confirm that I want to deactivate this or cancel. And if I confirm, it's gone. So a very simple dummy app here using Vue free. Now here we can use two new features, teleport and fragments. Let's start with teleport. If I open this modal, we can inspect this in the DevTools. And here in the Elements tab, we actually see that this dialog and the backdrop is rendered somewhere nested in our element tree, right? So this is the real DOM and our backdrop and dialog is deeply nested in the DOM. Now, visually, that's no problem, but it's actually not perfect for semantics, for accessibility maybe, and it could even break your styling if you don't work with setIndex, for example. In general, this of course should be an overlay to the app, so logically it should not be deeply nested in the DOM tree. Instead, it should be directly inside of the body, for example. Now, this is not something you technically need, but it simply would be a bit better logically, semantically, from accessibility perspectives. And hence, it would be great if we could move this div and the dialog to a different place in the DOM. With Vue 2, this wasn't really possible. With Vue free, it is. We now got a feature called teleport. If you know React, there it's called portal. Now, how does it work? In the component where you want to move things, for example, here in the confirm dialog component, you can simply wrap your entire component here, your entire template, with a new built-in teleport component, just like this. And then on teleport, you need the toProp where you pass in a CSS selector. For example, selecting the body element to make it clear that everything in here should actually be rendered directly in the body. Now you still use this component as you did before, so I can still use it in the template of another nested component as I'm doing here in admin mode. This is still possible. We can still pass props to this component, listen to events. This all works as you learned it. But now the actual DOM, which is rendered, will be rendered in a different place. If we save that and reload, I can still view this modal, but if we now inspect it, we see this div, the backdrop, the dialog, and the div which holds both, that's now directly in the body. It's not deeply nested in our other component tree, in our other node tree, I should say. So that's teleport. A nice new feature which allows you to write semantically more correct HTML code, I guess. Another nice feature is the fragment feature. Here in admin mode, I got this confirm dialog inside of this list item. Now technically I can place it anywhere because we just learned that the HTML code will be rendered somewhere else. But still, to make it clear that this is not really in the list item, it just belongs to this component, we might want to move it out of there. And with Vue 2, this was not allowed. My IDE still gives me an error here, but I can tell you with Vue free, this is allowed. With Vue free, you may have multiple root elements inside of your component template. You're not restricted to have just one. You can have multiple sibling elements directly in your template. This is new. This was not supported with Vue 2. Now with Vue free, this works, as you can tell. We got no error here. And that's teleport and fragments. Now the biggest new feature, which is 100% optional, is the composition API. The composition API can replace the existing options API. And I actually want to take a closer look at this composition API, therefore I'll have this in a separate video, which you of course find also linked below this video. Before we go to that separate video though, here's the last new feature I want to touch on. It's kind of new, TypeScript support. You always could use TypeScript with Vue. With Vue Free it's now easier, because Vue Free internally is built with TypeScript. Now, if you want to learn more about that, I recommend the official docs. There, you can learn all about TypeScript support and how to use TypeScript in your Vue Free projects and how to write TypeScript code there. It's an alternative. You don't have to use TypeScript. I'm using JavaScript in most of my projects, but you can use TypeScript if you prefer that.